Since Lauren's book is such a wonderful evocation of a marriage, and I was thinking about relationships, and it made me go back to thinking about one of my favorite poets, Robert Creeley, and I thought I would start by reading two poems by Robert Creeley that I love very much that I felt were relevant to tonight. The first one is called The Warning, which I know by heart, actually. For love, I would split open your head and put a candle in between the eyes. Love is dead in us if we forget the virtues of an amulet and quick surprise. And the other one, a little longer, is called A Form of Adaptation by Robert Creeley. My enemies came to get me, among them a beautiful woman. And God, I thought, this will be the end of me because I have no resistance. Taking their part against me even, flattered that they were concerned, I lay down before them and looked up soulfully, thinking perhaps that might help. And she bent over me to look at me then, being a woman. They are wise to send their strongest first, I thought, and I kissed her. And they watched her and both of us carefully, not at all to be tricked. But how account for love, even if you look for it? I trusted it. So I just thought we would have that in our minds as we think about this wonderful book by Lauren Groff, who is the author of the novel, The Monsters of Templeton, one of her former novels, shortlisted for the Orange Prize for New Writers. She has a wonderful collection of stories called Delicate Edible Birds, and Arcadia, which was a New York Times notable book and winner of the Medici Book Club Prize, and a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Award, which was set on a hippie commune in upstate New York. Arcadia spans a period of time from 1965 to 2018, and it coaxed forth a remarkable amount of suspense from the way her characters changed over time. As the New York Times critic noted, a book that might have been small, dated, and insular winds up feeling timeless and vast. And in a similar way, her daring third novel, Fates and Furies, which she'll discuss tonight with Julie Robinson, covers 2 decades between a husband and a wife. It's a complex, albeit harrowing look at marriage, and it's received ecstatic reviews and was just longlisted for the National Book Award. Lauren Groff lives in Gainesville, Florida, where she writes in a studio garage, a room with minimal temperature control, she notes. And she shares a house with her 2 sons and a husband whom she's described in an interview as reasonable, someone, she says, who takes care of me in a million ways. Her new novel bespeaks her wisdom on both the comforts and indignities of romantic partnerships. Marriage, as those of us who are married know, is a strange beast, especially to those inside of it. Groff's work has appeared in journals including The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, Tin House, McSweeney's, and Plowshares, and in several anthologies including 100 Years of the Best American Short Stories. And in conversation with Lauren tonight, we welcome Julie Robinson, who is the founder and creative force behind Literary Affairs, a nonprofit based in Beverly Hills. Julie runs over 30 book clubs a month. I know one of them is here tonight, so welcome to Julie's Book Club, as well as leading classic literary lunches, literary tours, and more. And I've been to a guest at her marvelous Beverly Hills Literary Escape a few years ago, where I had the pleasure of seeing Julie and Lauren speaking together on a panel, and it's a great pleasure to welcome them both to ALOUD tonight and to the stage of the Los Angeles Public Library. After they're here, after they have their conversation, we will open to you for some questions, and Lauren will be signing her book in the lobby afterwards. Please join me in welcoming Lauren Groff and Julie Robinson. Thank you.
So much work goes into the opening of a book. So much work goes into the first chapter. And it's a really interesting thing to go back sometimes after you've read the whole book and read the first chapter, because you see things in there that were foreshadowed or were hinted at that really give you an idea of what the story is about. And I thought a good way to start tonight would be to have Lauren read the opening of her book, because I think it's just the perfect example of drawing you in, getting your curiosity piqued, and also really kind of tipping your hand a little bit to give you an idea of where she's going with the novel.
Okay, so there's sex in it, just FYI.
That's why we're reading it.
I know. I wanted to start this book with a bang, literally. All right. Here we go. A thick drizzle from the sky, like a curtain sudden sweeping. The seabirds stopped their tuning. The ocean went mute. House lights over the water dimmed to gray. 2 people were coming up the beach. She was fair and sharp in a green bikini, though it was May in Maine and cold. He was tall, vivid. A light flickered in him that caught the eye and held it. Their names were Lotto and Mathilde. For a minute, they watched a tide pool full of spiny creatures that sent up curls of sand and vanishing. Then he took her face in his hands, kissed her pale lips. He could die right now of happiness. In a vision, he saw the sea rising up to suck them in, tonguing off their flesh and rolling their bones over its coral molars in the deep. If she was beside him, he thought, he would float out singing. Well, he was young, 22, and they had been married that morning in secret. Extravagance under the circumstances could be forgiven. Her fingers down the back of his trunks seared his skin. She pushed him backward, walking him up a dune covered in beach pea stalks, down again to where the wall of sand blocked the wind, where they felt warmer. Under the bikini top, her goose flesh had taken on a lunar blue, and her nipples in the cold turned inward. On their knees now, though the sand was rough and hurt, it didn't matter. They were reduced to mouths and hands. He swept her legs to his hips, pressed her down, blanketed her with his heat until she stopped shivering, made a dune of his back. Her raw knees were raised to the sky. He longed for something wordless and potent. What? To wear her. He imagined living in her warmth forever. People in his life had fallen away from him one by one like dominoes. Every movement pinned her further, so she could not abandon him. He imagined a lifetime of screwing on the beach until they were one of those ancient pairs speed-walking in the morning, skin like lacquered walnut meat. Thank you. Nobody ever laughed. Even old, he would waltz her into the dunes and have his way with her sexy, frail bird bones, the plastic hips, the bionic knee. Drone lifeguards looming up in the sky, flashing their lights, booming fornicators to rouse them guiltily out. This for eternity. He closed his eyes and wished. Her eyelashes on his cheek, her thighs on his waist, the first consummation of the terrifying thing they'd done. Marriage meant forever. He'd planned for a proper bed, a sense of ceremony. He'd stolen in his roommate Samuel's beach house, having spent most summers there since he was 15, knowing that they hid the key under the hawksbill turtle carapace in the garden. A house of tartan and liberty print and fiesta ware, thick with dust, the guest room with the lighthouse's triple blink in the night, the craggy beach below. This was what Lotto had imagined for the first time with this gorgeous girl he'd magicked into wife. But Mathilde was right to agitate for plein air consummation. She was always right. He would know this soon enough. It was over too quickly. When she shouted, the gulls hidden by the dune buckshot the low clouds. Later, she'd show him the abrasion against her 8th vertebra from a mussel shell when he dug her in and dug her in. They were pressed so close that when they laughed, his laugh rose from her belly, hers from his throat. He kissed her cheekbones, her clavicle, the pale of her wrist with its root-like blue veins. His terrible hunger he'd thought would be sated was not, the end apparent in the beginning. My wife, he said, mine. Perhaps instead of wearing her, he could swallow her whole. Oh, she said, right, because I'm chattel, because my royal family traded me for 3 mules and a bucket of butter. I love your butter bucket, he said. My butter bucket now, so salty, so sweet. Stop, she said. She'd lost her smile so shy and constant that he was startled to see her up close without it. Nobody belongs to anybody. We've done something bigger. It's new. He looked at her thoughtfully, gently bit the tip of her nose. He had loved her with all of his might these 2 weeks, and, in so loving, had considered her transparent, a plate of glass. He could see through to the goodness at her quick. But glass is fragile. He would have to be careful. You're right, he said, thinking how deeply they belonged, how surely. Between his skin and hers, there was the smallest of spaces, barely enough for air, for this slick of sweat now chilling. Even still, a third person, their marriage had slid in. All right, thank you. A little vocal fry there.
So obviously, one of the things that we always associate with the traditional romantic view of marriage is that two become one. But you seem to be defining marriage a little bit different in this book.
Yes.
How?
Okay. Well, two do not necessarily become one. I mean, they become one in a very specific way, and it's paradoxical in a way, right? Because marriage is, and in intimate partnership too, I don't want to exclude, an intimate partnership is incredibly intimate, right? It's one of the most intimate things people can do between two people, but it's also incredibly performative. So you do it for the benefit of other people also, right? Other people watch a marriage. It's this one unity made of two highly individual people. So what I wanted to think about autonomy and well, obviously we can talk about this later, but creativity and all sorts of other things within the marriage. And I sort of see marriage in this book as being, and I've said this before. I'm sorry if you've heard it before, but. Marriage is to this book as a bomb casing is to a bomb. It's what contains it, but it's not what it's about in a certain way. So.
Mm-hmm. And what it's containing is these two people, these two individuals, Lotto and Matilde, who are just fascinating. But I think that if you read a lot of the reviews and you give somebody a synopsis of the book, you would assume that it's a simple he said, she said novel. But if you have a typical he said, she said, you would expect it to be two first-person narratives. But what you've done is you've chosen to use like a close third person and then keep expanding it. It expands and contracts as we're reading it, and it has like a real theatrical effect, which is fascinating. And I wanted you to talk a little bit, just on a process, why you made those choices.
In my head, just from the beginning, it was always third person. And it's possible because my models for this book were all third-person narratives. I mean, I don't know if you've read, but Mr. Bridge and Mrs. Bridge by Evan S. Connell. These are like the most amazing books, some of the most amazing books of the 20th century. Or Jane Gardam's Old Filth and The Man in the Wooden Hat. Jane Gardam is like a mega genius that nobody ever reads in the United States. She's published by Europa.
Europa does the best
Europa's the best. I mean, and Europa does Elena Ferrante too. So I mean, they know their stuff. So. These are books, sort of he said, she said, third person. And what I like about the third person when it comes to marriage is that the reader becomes a spectator in this very intimate thing, right? So the reader almost becomes an embodiment of the marriage itself in a certain way, right? I mean, you're there with them, but you're also watching it at the same time. It was sort of, I'm leading you back to sort of my answer to the first question.
Mm-hmm. And basically what I thought of while I was reading it is when my kids were little, we went to Pompeii, and I remember buying them this book where the page was the ruins. And then there was this transparent page that you could lay on top of it, and all of a sudden you could see visually what it was in the past. And that idea of laying on top, I felt like that was very much the experience of reading your book.
Good.
Yeah.
That was intentional. I'm really glad. Thank you. Well, yeah, because there's no such thing as a single story, right? I mean, Chimamanda Ngozi, I think that's how you pronounce her name, has this wonderful TED Talk about the dangers of a single story, right? And within a marriage, there's always at least two stories, right? Whenever two human beings are in a room and they witness something, there's always going to be multiple stories. And so, and it kind of, it's interesting within a marriage, the idea of narrative within a marriage, because it's not just that people start telling the same stories over time because they hear it back and forth, but also some people lose their own personal stories through the marriage. And I thought that was really interesting, right? Whether or not they keep them within their mind, the way that they present them to other people becomes transformed through the process of always rubbing up against someone else's story.
Mm-hmm. So in essence, when we're reading the first section, Matilde is a blank slate.
Yeah.
And you can really see how Lotto is projecting his idea of what she is on top of her. We have the specificity of these two characters in the book, but my question is, do you feel that that is a necessary component of marriage? And is that something that we all do on some level?
I have no idea. I can only talk about my marriage, unfortunately. I definitely project on my husband. He's not here to defend himself. So, yeah. I don't know. I think, I mean, I've been thinking about this a lot because you talk a lot about marriage when you're on a book tour about a book about marriage, right? But one of the things that I've been seeing is that if you try to imagine the interior life of your partner, whoever the partner is, that's when you start feeling closer to that person. It's almost imaginary because you can never know what is truly within someone else's brain and in their heart. And in a marriage, that's a good thing, right? Because there are all sorts of mini aggressions and mini irritations that you cannot express, or else you would just crush the other person. So there is a certain amount of projection of another story, but there's also a certain amount of deep inquiry that I find really fascinating. Because if that inquiry is gone, what do you have? But a cipher, really, frankly, right? As someone who just does something in order to benefit you.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm talking about in the two parts of the book.
And I think that really comes through this whole idea of, most people would say that the goal is to know. But I think on some level it's desirable, as you were saying, to not know. There's a great short novella by George Eliot that not a lot of people know about called The Lifted Veil. I don't know if you're familiar. They had this protagonist, and he had the ability to read people's minds. And it ended up being torture for him.
Yeah.
And there was just this one woman, Bertha, that he couldn't read her mind, and he was infatuated with her. She was the one who he was attracted to. So it is an interesting component that you had in the book, this idea of whether or not it's desirable. But do you think it's part of our need to tell stories, to be storytellers?
Do we have a need to tell stories? I don't know. What do you mean?
The fact that as we, each of your characters, in a way, they're creating a narrative of their life.
Right.
As they're living it, they're creating a narrative. And who knows whether there's truth to it or not, especially the fact that within the novel, you actually retell scenes. And yet they feel very different. They feel very unique and fresh, even though we are actually hearing the same scene told over. So this idea that as a person you are creating a story.
Yeah, but I wonder, I don't know, right? But I wonder if it's a more modern invention to see your life in terms of a story, right? For the larger part of human existence, there was no such thing as, well, I mean, there was oral narratives, I guess, but there weren't books and there weren't movies. I mean, I remember being a kid and walking around being like, and then Lauren goes this way, like, right, you're the protagonist of your own story, no matter
about
what
yourself
you
in
do.
the third person.
Always, right? No, I hope not. But yeah, but I did wonder for a while if people started seeing themselves as the protagonists of their own stories with the advent of the sort of more bourgeois central character that only came with the novel, right? I mean, before the advent of the novel, most stories being told and disseminated were about princes or kings or knights or, an elevated tragic hero. I mean, even all Greek drama and Greek myth is about the highest houses in Greece. So I wonder if the average person would have walked around seeing themselves as this central figure in a drama, and I would probably say no. I don't know, and it's fascinating. Possibly, and I'm just completely projecting, but to imagine that shift between a person just living and a person starting to frame his own life as a story, right? I don't know. I would have to talk to a narrative historian, but I suspect it was with the advent of the cheaply disseminated novel.
To go to something totally different, one of the things that I loved about Arcadia was that you used kind of as a scaffolding or as an echo Grimm's fairy tales. And then now in this book, we have it right in the title, Fates and Furies. We know that you're using Greek mythology. I want to know, what it was specifically about this Greek myth, these two myths that you wanted to utilize for this story, and how you structured using the Fates and the Furies, which for people who haven't read it yet, those are the two sections that are labeled. The husband Lotto is Fate, and Matilde is Furies.
Right. So That didn't come up, the title and the connection didn't come up until way deep into the creation of the book. And what I do is it's super nutty. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, but it's just what I do. Is that I write these very fast, 3-month full drafts and longhand, and then put them aside, never go back to see them again. They're just done, right? And then I start over again trying to address a lot of the structural or larger, deeper issues without necessarily thinking about the surface issues. This does a lot of things for me. One of it, which, we can talk about this more because people get affronted by this process. But one of the things that it does is it builds the story layer by layer, like a 3-dimensional printer in a way. But the other thing that it does is it has the benefit of taking everything that I am absolutely passionate about at the time of writing the book, and it sort of seeps it like a cake with rum, into the book. So I went through multiple phases over the course of writing this book. One of the phases was Shakespeare, right? So I had this project, which was foolish, to read every play of Shakespeare's, which I did up until the histories, and then I just couldn't do it anymore. I was just done, because they're not all great. I mean, Shakespeare, but the histories. But so in A Midsummer Night's Dream, there's this wonderful play within a play, and by this time I had already figured out that Lotta was going to be a playwright, and there's this. It's the marriage of Pyramus and Thisbe. And there's this quote, which I will not be able to quote because I can't do it. I'm not, I have no retention of these things, about the Fates and the Furies. So that was in my head, and in a previous just passion, I had done a few MOOCs, the massive online courses, and I can do these things because my children are now in school full-time, and it's awesome, and I had a nanny for the first few years of their lives too. So I had these MOOCs on Greek drama and the Greek tragic hero and mythology, things like that, and I was just in love with the ideas of these 2 trios of sisters. The Fates are, if you're not familiar with them, they're these sisters who create the thread of life. One of them creates the thread of life, another one measures it out, and the third one cuts it. So that's your destiny, right? They create your destiny. Even the gods are subject to them. And the Furies are these chthonic goddesses who are just badasses. And they were created, and this is one of my favorite origin stories of Greek mythology, there was a fight between Cronus and, I think it was Cronus and Zeus cut off his dad's penis and threw it into the ocean, and out of it came the Furies, but also Aphrodite. And the Furies they're depicted as these hags, but in my head they're these gorgeous, just like amazing, like dominatrix kind of women. And they chase after malefactors. They just go after people who do terrible, terrible things. So I love this idea of these incredibly powerful women who have completely different philosophies on life and what is underlying life. And I think that my main characters, Lotta and Mathilde, have extremely different and in some ways opposing philosophies about life.
Mm-hmm. Which is interesting to watch as the 2 stories start to meld together, because that's one of the questions, when you think about a lot of people that have in mind the type of person that they have to marry, or your parents feel like you have to marry somebody that's very similar in order for your marriage to work. You have 2 people that their worldview is polar opposite to the other person. Mm-hmm. Did you see that as something that could have threatened the marriage as you were writing the story?
I didn't, because I knew that it was going to be a happy marriage from the beginning. Mm-hmm. Because I had a hard time coming up with any, and you can because you're like the best reader on the planet, but any happy marriages in novels. I mean, I can think of Levin and Kitty at the end of Honor Karenina, right? And then there's the end of Middlemarch. It's Dorothea and whatever week. I don't like
She's pretty
him.
disappointed
But
with
she's
her small life.
disappointed with her small life, right? I mean, the last few lines. But there aren't that many happy marriages in literature. And that drove me nuts because that's not, I think God, I'm married to a great guy, but that's not necessarily my vision of marriage. It's in literature, it's this big tragic thing where people all cheat on one another like rabbits and like go off to the corners, and like that blows up the marriage. But it's not very common, and so I from the beginning that was one of my challenges.
And it's an interesting challenge because when you and I talked about Arcadia, one of the things you said very clearly was that it was a book that was really exploring how to be happy in America. And we watched Bitt struggle with that throughout his life. In this book, it seems like you're really kind of questioning how to be happy in a marriage, or how would you define happiness in a marriage?
So just going back a little bit, I think it's probably just being alive to the other person and trying to have a constant idea of what may be happening within the other person too. I don't know. I mean, if I knew, I would be selling 1 billion books, right? And they would all be nonfiction. I have no idea, but
I love that you're being honest.
Oh,
I love that you're
God.
saying I don't know, because if you really think about it, and you and I have talked about this before, it's so many times even when you finish a book, don't you feel like you have more questions than when you started?
Oh my God, yes. No, so I went into this book thinking, you always go into a book thinking you're going to dig into this mysterious, ambiguous space within you, right? And the mysterious, ambiguous space within me for this book was this truly strange scenario I found myself in, which is, I do not believe in the institution of marriage. I don't believe in it. I think it's retrogressive. I think that it's incredibly misogynistic. I think just the history of it is kind of ugly. And yet at the same time, I have this beautiful thing in my own life, and it was the best thing that I ever did, and it was the best decision I ever made. So trying to make heads or tails of how this could possibly happen in one person, it was really difficult. So I spent a lot of time trying to think it through, and I came up with 0 answers, but 1,000,000 complications, right? And that's what happens when you write novels. I think it's the opposite of when you try to write nonfiction. You try to answer the questions, but in fiction, questions just beget more questions in the night.
And you were just saying before that, we were saying that they came from 2 totally different backgrounds. And you said in an interview recently that this book was exploring the nature of privilege. And I'm curious why that was of interest to you.
Oh, so I live in Florida. And I go to the gym, and I love my gym buddies. They're great. They're these 4 guys in their mid-60s to 70s, and they're just really fun, right? But they have this view of the world that is so unquestioned, right? They got what they got because they're good people and they worked hard, right? And I look at them and I try really hard not to argue, but I argue. And I want to say, you were raised in America. You are white men. You have been given free education throughout your lives. You've been given a relatively peaceful existence where most of our wars have been shipped to other places. You've been given so much that is invisible to you, and that is offensive to me, right? So, I try really hard to not, get into it because there are 4 of them and 1 of me.
When they read the book, they'll know what you think.
Oh, no, but they do already. I mean, no, I get into it a lot. And I mean, I wear my Planned Parenthood shirt, and they're all like, because this big brouhaha. So I wanted, to talk about privilege and to talk about the blindness of privilege, and a lot of the ways that the invisible threads of how most of us, many of us, not most of us, many of us have been supported from the beginning that we just don't acknowledge all that often. Because acknowledging our privilege is one step toward making sure that everybody else gets the same privileges too. And I'm kind of like a secret radical in that way. It's not secret. You read my last book. Yeah.
And then, in juxtaposition, you have a character who obviously has been raised in the polar opposite of not having privilege, and you really explored Mathilde's background. And so it seemed like you were really delving into this whole idea of how much impact our family of origin has on us, and how we carry that into relationships. How did you see that affecting, let's just start with Lotto. First of all, his mother, Antoinette, the whole time I was reading the book, I saw her as a Southern Belle, Miss Havisham.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
And they had a really interesting relationship, and I wanted to bring that up a little bit because we're both mothers of sons.
Yes.
And one of the things I've noticed about your work as it's matured is because a lot of your life experiences have changed. I mean, when you wrote Monsters of Templeton, you didn't have children, and now you have 2 boys. So you have this interesting line that Antoinette says where she says, boys belong to their mothers, cord cut decades ago, but they'll always share the warm, dark swim. And there's a great scene when Lotto is young, and a word that comes up quite often in the book, this idea of separateness. And that's something that he really struggles with. And in that section you just read, it seems like he feels that that hole is going to be filled by Mathilde. I wanted you to talk a little bit about that idea of trying to fulfill needs from our childhood through relationships and marriages, and if you were playing that out a little bit in this novel.
I think I was, but I also, that the line that you were quoting was me giving a wink at myself because, this is how I feel about my sons now, but someday they're going to bring a Mathilde into the house. Right?
And you're going to hate her.
I truly hope my mother-in-law does not hate me, but she probably does. I don't know. There's these little boys, they're mine. Just the mere, I made them. Nobody else gets them. So it was a little bit of acknowledging that it's hard to raise small children and then send them out into the world. And to see them become autonomous people. And I do think we seek in our partners what we feel is lacking in ourselves as individuals. I think that is probably true, or it's something that complements who we are as individuals too. My husband, he would never have gotten into a fight with 4 guys in a gym. I mean, he's just gentle and kind and sweet and loving. I mean, we're very, very opposite in that way. Yeah,
that's funny. One of the things that you also brought up in Arcadia that I saw kind of start flowing into this book as well, since we're talking about the idea of happiness and fulfilling things and this idea of seeking. One of the things that you had Bit and his mother both deal with was depression. And if you read a lot of the reviews right now that are coming up, Lotto's depression comes up quite often. But I feel like there was something a little more complicated going on with Lotto. I would almost say he was bipolar. And I think that it's a really interesting thing to explore from the idea of creativity, which I do want to get into and talk about because I think it's a major idea that runs through the whole book. But how do you see the creativity tying into his illness? Because really we think about it when Michael Cunningham wrote The Hours, he really played with that whole paradigm, especially referring to Virginia Woolf, of the madness, creativity, and genius all kind of being wound in together. Were you working with that with Lotto?
I do think, I would agree with you that I would say that he's probably bipolar. And it may not have been diagnosed, but I think he probably is. If anything, however, I think I was probably working against the idea a little bit of the creativity and madness. Primarily because when he's deeply depressed, he does nothing. I mean, he can't do anything. All he can do is lie on the couch and read. Reading is a part of writing. Deeply, it is. But I don't necessarily believe that the depression makes one a creative person. And in fact, I believe it opposite in my life because I have anxiety issues. I have sadness issues, and the way I get around them is actually by physicality, turning off my brain in a certain way. I start exercising more. I have to, every single day, I have to exercise at least an hour, because if I don't do that, I start going down this spiral of anxiety, and it becomes really bleak and black. And I don't want to be on drugs, because drugs keep me from writing. So there's a part of me that deeply resists this somewhat romantic idea of depression and creativity, because I think that a lot of times it's the opposite, right? It keeps you from doing what you should be doing. At the same time, it makes you entirely vulnerable and skinless, and that has to contribute to the creation of something perhaps later. You know, because I think a lot of the people who I admire, they have this element of being profoundly vulnerable at times, and the world is almost too much, and that could be another way of saying depressed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But the thing that was interesting about the dynamic between the two of them is because of this aspect of his personality, it really throws Mathilde into the role of caregiver,
Right.
which we do see from two different perspectives. How did you see her as that caregiver, or how did it impact, you think, her feelings and her relationship with him?
No, she's absolutely a caregiver. I mean, she's codependent, or he's dependent on her, and he doesn't quite understand how. You know, she's always, and I don't want to give anything away, but I know, right? It's so hard. She's thoughtful, and she thinks of things long term, right? And so there's certain decisions that she makes in the moment that have a large long-term effect. And one of these decisions is being the midwife to his creative endeavors. And she's able to do that because she loves him very deeply, and she's able to understand that this is the way that he can come out of these deep blue funks. Yeah.
And we find out quite a bit of what she was doing to
Yeah.
be his helper, kind of being the puppeteer behind
Not
the scenes a little bit.
puppeteer, but yeah, close. Yeah, yeah.
Since we're talking about creativity and this whole idea of the two of them together, there's a really great scene in the book where he's up on the stage and he spouts his feelings about the difference between male and female creativity. Where did that come from?
So what Lotto says is he's just being dopey. Like, he's got this charisma, and he's able to say a lot of things that sound really smart. And people generally, like, oh, whatever you say is wonderful, right? So he does this performance, and he's giving a talk, and he says something about how the reason why there's so few geniuses in the theater, in the history of theater, that are women, is because women have historically been funneling their creativity into creating babies. And where this came from, actually, is this conversation that I had with a man who I think is like just a genuine, good-hearted person who thinks of himself as a feminist, who said this to me. And it's just one of those moments where your irritation doesn't even kick in, because you're like, what just happened? What did he just say to me? And you just say, and later you sit up in the middle of the night going, no, this is biological determinism. I don't believe in this. This is horrible, right? And it's another aspect of the privilege that we were talking about, right? This idea of, women are geniuses at creating life. And women are geniuses at creating life, but women can also be geniuses at creating other things too, right? It's not, one or the other. It's not a net zero game. So the next day we had a very serious talk, that man and I.
And then you got the rest of it out in the book. On creativity, I thought there was a really interesting passage that you had that really brought up the thought of how autobiographical creativity can be. And this is Lotto speaking. As if stepping out of a fog, little boy, a grown man, characters who were him but also not, Lotto transformed by the omniscient view. A shock of energy as he looked on them in the morning. There was life in these figures. He was suddenly hungry to return to that world, to live in it for a while longer. Where's the Lauren autobiographical element?
In this book?
In this book, in your work in
Oh,
general,
it's everywhere.
and about creativity,
Yeah.
the source of the creativity.
So when you write a book, every character is you in a way. You know, Flaubert famously said, you know, Madame Bovary, c'est moi. And it's true, right? I mean, he wasn't being facetious. He wasn't saying, you know, I'm a bourgeoise woman who read too many romances and had a lot of affairs with dashing men, which he may have, I don't know. I don't know, possibly.
That's another interview.
I know. But what he was saying is, you know, because he is this individual person, the experiences that he's writing through this character are so vivid and they come from him, right? So Lotto and Mathilde, they're me in very separate ways. And I thought for a long time, at first I thought, you know, I was going to write Lotto as a substitute for me, because I thought that one of the things about him was not being able to question his privilege. And I've been just extraordinarily privileged. I've had wonderful parents. I've had a good education, right? And I feel uncomfortable, deeply uncomfortable with my privilege. And also I have this husband. He's just like the best person, right? And he pays the bills, right? It's great. So I had this guilt. I had this feeling of I wanted to almost apologize and imagine him. But then I moved away from Lotto in a certain way because he suddenly became almost reprehensible to me, and I had to work my way back through him. And I was writing the characters simultaneously, and one day I just realized, actually, Mathilde, she's me too. This is really frightening. There's certain elements of who she is that are elements that come directly from me, and so these are things that, you know, you have to negotiate when you go through these texts, and you sometimes just make it really fun. You know, you pull it out a little bit and play around a little bit with it, and you know, like I actually have this like cameo in the book myself, but I also have a ton of little winks at my friends, you know, inside jokes. Like the joke that Lotto tells at a story is a joke that my sister-in-law tells all the time. And when she read it, she actually called me. She's like, "Oh, my joke is in your book." You know, like, this is really great. So everything in a book comes from you in a certain way. And it's just a matter of distance, right? So Arcadia is this book that's just like within the core of my heart, because it's deeply personal without necessarily being autobiographical. I've never been a little boy, you know, and I've never lived on a 1970s through 80s commune. But it's one of those books that, you know, it was the most personal thing. This one was also very personal without being whatsoever autobiographical, and my first book was somewhat autobiographical. So as a first book is.
What I love about all your work, since you just brought up how close you felt to Arcadia, I mean, I cried during parts of Arcadia because I just thought it was so beautiful. And what you said is true. Each one of your books is so unique. The setting's different. The characters are different. You just go, I mean, you definitely are not one of those writers that writes the same book over and over. They're so unique. And yet what's beautiful is that there's something about the human experience that is so relatable in every one of them. Like you said, we're not all going to go run off and live on a commune, but we do, as parents, try to raise our children in the best utopian world that we can. We try to create it. And I feel like you're doing that again here in Fates and Furies. You know, we might not have this exact experience. Like you were saying, you only know your marriage, I only know my marriage. But there's something in there that just resonates with what your own life is. And it's really interesting that you're able to always capture that in every book.
Thank you. That's the best compliment ever. And from you. Thank
I
you.
worked on that one.
Thank you.
At 3 a.m, it just came to me.
Wow.
Yeah. You mentioned something when you were just talking about something else, but you talked about how you wrote it, that you were writing both characters simultaneously. How was that possible, and how did you work it back, and did you have to like rework things?
Well, not only was I writing both characters simultaneously, I was actually writing about half of Arcadia at the same time as starting this book.
Really?
Well, and part of it's going back to what you were saying. I always with the next book, push against what I did almost immediately before. So Fates and Furies in some ways pushes very hard against Arcadia, and it's very much the opposite book to Arcadia, and it's intentional because I never want to write the same book again. If I do, I trust you to tell me. Right?
So what were you pushing back against? What was it that you?
It was. I mean, it was within. It was hyper intimate within this mindset of a little boy. The structure was linear in a very clear way. The relationships were complicated, but not as intensely complicated. There's a color. So I write with colors in mind, and my intended colors were different. So. And I mean, it was all very different. And one of the reasons why I did this was because as I was writing Arcadia, I started to despair because, well, it's a book about despair, but it's also, I was like, nobody's ever going to read this, like it's not going to get published. It's like, my career's over. So I started Fates and Furies as sort of a way to hedge my bets. I'm like, at least I'm in the middle of something else. And I like to work on multiple things at once. I'm almost always writing multiple things at once because I find that, it's a source of energy. One thing bounces off the other, and it's a lot of energy going back and forth. But with this book, I started actually, so I would get up from whatever frustration I was feeling in Arcadia, and I had these huge sheets of paper on my wall, and I'd write Lotto and immediately write Mathilde. So they were developed simultaneously, and they're the scenes where you see both scenes from different points of view were developed at the same time too. So I had a sort of a very basic nebulous idea of what events happened in the book, and then I just had to write it over and over and over again in longhand until I understood the deep, bone deep structure. And there's a hidden structure, particularly in the Furies part, that I will never reveal to anyone.
I know we're really tippy-toeing around so much tonight.
I know.
Because it's a book that really hinges on you being surprised.
I hope so,
And piecing it together for yourself as a reader.
Also, Arcadia wasn't, I feel like this one, I tried my hardest to make it like a fast read, right? I mean, it's like deeply fast read. I would hope, or not. I don't know. But Arcadia was much slower, as languorous, in a certain way. Just the tone of it was slower.
Well, and it also felt more internal.
Yes.
There was something about this book that was really fascinating, and it was the parenthetical phrases, the fact that you had these sections that are blocked out separately. And in The Guardian, I was laughing because you claimed you stole the idea of parenthetical omniscient voice from Virginia Woolf.
Yes.
But I beg to differ a little bit. You might have stole the tool or the actual parentheses, but I think you used them in a very different and unique way.
I did.
So what was your intention in using those?
So those of you who've read To the Lighthouse recently will
talked about it today in book club.
It's just like it's one of the best books ever written. It's just so massively brilliant. But it's told in 3 parts, right? And the first part is this interior, beautiful monologue that sort of flows like waves, and then the last part is too. But the central part is only about 12 pages. It's called Time Passes. And it's a vision of time passing mostly through the physical ramifications on the house in which the family in the first part was incredibly happy, right? So you see the wind coming in, you see the wallpaper peeling off, you see the mice.
Books are getting moldy.
Yeah, books are getting moldy. You see it like just the gradual disintegration of this house, and it's the most beautiful passage ever. And so time is the subject here, right? And the time in this is not human time, right? Because human time actually happens off the page in certain ways. And when human time comes in, it's in these brackets. I mean, the best part, and you probably know the full quote, but the best death ever
Ramsey.
is Mrs. Ramsey's death because it happens within brackets. It's Mr. Ramsey coming out in the hall, stretches out his arms for Mrs. Ramsey, but Mrs. Ramsey, having died in the night, is not there, something like that. And it's just
and that even though his
devastating.
arms are stretched out, they're empty.
Yes, yeah, which replicates the image of the brackets also. So that's where, form and function is doing the same thing there. But so I love that. I love that the human comes in these heartbreaking small moments. I knew that I was doing a different thing in this book. I was writing, I was hoping to write on a more granular human level, but I wanted sort of a different voice to swoop in like a hawk and swoop out again like a hawk, and have a different idea of time, because that's one other thing that this book is about time also. And I like the idea of a story being horizontal but also vertical sometimes too, and seeing it almost visually vertical at a certain moment.
Mhm. And it also had, I mean, a lot of those sections that you wrote had a lot of wit and humor. Like they really felt like you were almost addressing us with this omniscience.
Lotto's a playwright and he was an actor, right? So asides are massively important in a lot of plays, and they're also, in a way, the Greek chorus, and that sort of brings in the idea of the Greek dramas. But at the same time, too, it's just incredibly fun to write. You know, to be this person swooping in and out of the story and sort of saying, "You're with me," and being intimate in that space, right, with the reader.
We're just going to talk for a couple more minutes, and then I'm going to open it up for questions, because I'm sure everybody has a lot of questions for Lauren. But since we're just talking about Virginia Woolf, I just want to say one of my favorite lines, which I think relates to your book very much, is at the end of To the Lighthouse, when James is talking about the lighthouse, and he says, "For nothing is simply one thing."
Yes. Oh, yes. Right. Exactly.
And I think that's really what we as readers are experiencing here in this book, is that we have a belief of what is going on, and then all of a sudden it is still what's going on, but it's just you're seeing it from a different totally perspective. The other thing I just want to talk about real quick before we open it up is the imagery that you have from the Fates. You really have this tenuous thread kind of being repetitively talked about and running through the idea of the thread of life, which the Fates are in charge of. I think that that's one of the things that's interesting about your two characters is, when we talk about life, we talk about the fact that we all know we're going to die. We understand that our mortality is part of our life. But we all have different ways of coping with that and having that knowledge, but living with it daily, which really plays out this idea of fate and destiny versus being able to control your life. I want you to talk a little bit about that ability and how you see each of your characters living with that knowledge.
I don't know that actually most people truly know that they're going to die, right? I really don't. I think that a lot of it's something that we know intellectually, but not necessarily emotionally until we come up close to death or we come up close to someone who has died, and it's a big surprise sometimes, and we can talk about that.
But isn't that part of the whole aspect of creativity, and starting with early writers and moving all the way up into your work, is this idea that creativity, creating something, somehow is your immortality, that it's very important to each of these characters that they somehow create something.
And it may just go back to the fact that we're all animals and we want to spread our seed into the world, right?
Pee on the tree.
Pee on the tree, leave our traces within the next generation, and I don't know. Yeah, I possibly creativity is a way to funnel death into a more edible form, but I think that's a very intellectualized way of looking at it, and I think a lot of people don't see it necessarily that way. I definitely don't, because I know probably that when my boys die, my books will probably die too. You know what I mean? That's it, and that's okay. I do it for the pleasure of the moment, and it's a deep, profound, perfect pleasure when you are chasing the tail of a story for hours and you come out just elated. It's just one of the best things ever. So.
And the only other thing that beats it is reading it.
No.
Really? I mean, we all have had that feeling of just being taken on a ride, taken on a journey by a great writer like you. And when we close that last page, it's so fulfilling. It's so wonderful. And the fact that you can create that for us is amazing. Do we want to start with the questions, Louise? Oh, thanks.
First of all, I wanted to thank you in person for the Planned Parenthood fundraiser that you did. I've
Thank
thought about it a
you.
lot in the
Thank
last month,
you. Thanks.
and it was a wonderful thing. And I wanted to say that I've read the reviews. I haven't finished the book, but I've read most of it, and it seems to me more than it being about a marriage, it's kind of about intimacy and how the secrets we keep sort of, we trip ourselves up with that. And
Yeah.
so I've been kind of surprised that people say, oh, you're going to see a marriage. And I thought really the thing that's caught me in it is that. And I wondered, Amy Bloom had a great quote, like intimacy, it's not for everybody. It's not everyone's cup of tea. And I thought about that a lot reading this. I wondered if when you were writing the characters, if you saw them becoming closer or eternally separated by that.
So I actually believe maybe the opposite. I think that the quiet daily rebellions that we have with our loved ones are the things sometimes that keep us together, right? Because you don't want to say everything, because that would be insulting and terrible. Just for instance, because I'm throwing him under the bus because he's not here, my husband. There are days when I'll be like, oh, there's a hair coming out of his ear. It's so gross, right? But I know that in that moment, I can't say it because it would crush something essential in him. That he's like tender or something at the moment. So you keep these things to yourselves. I don't necessarily believe that this fad of saying everything to our beloveds is a good one, right? So I wouldn't say that this book is sort of a melodramatic defense of keeping secrets, but I would say that it's one of those secrets, and revealing is this very delicate balance, and maybe that's what keeps people close, is trying to keep that balance right. I don't know. But I think you're right. It's a book about intimacy. I mean, they didn't have to be married in order to be the people that they were in the relationship that they were. Yeah.
There's someone down here.
Hi, I have a question about Arcadia, if that's okay.
Sure.
I'm wondering, towards the last 20-30% of the book, there's a lot of death and endings and disease, and on both sides of the utopian society and also with regular society. And I'm wondering what the commentary was that from your position. Are you saying that nothing's really perfect, it all can go bad, there's a glimmer of hope at the end? The very, very end of the book is a glimmer of hope with a new relationship. But are you sort of saying that it doesn't really matter if you try to have perfection or you just live within normal and find your own perfection? Sort of you end up at the same place, so they're all as vulnerable? Or what was the crux of that in your mind?
Well, I don't think that, my interpretation of the book, which is different from everyone else's, and mine is no more privileged than anyone else's, is that it's not necessarily whether or not anything succeeds. It's the nobility of the effort that matters. So I wouldn't say that the darkness and the death was what matters. It was that people were engaged deeply. And that was the beauty of the situation, right? And that's what I would like for people to take away from the book, the nobility.
And that was a lot of when we were talking about Arcadia, the whole idea of the American dream, and that doesn't allow for failure.
Right.
And that failure in some way, there's still nobility in the struggle, in the try. I mean, there is beauty in that, and we respect people for trying.
I mean, not to get too dark and deep about this, but we're all going to fail at one time, but our lives matter, right? Our lives matter deeply. And everything that we do matters very deeply. Just because we're going to die one day, that doesn't mean that it's all gone to naught. So try your hardest, like do your best, be the best person that you can. I mean, that's really what I was writing toward at the end of that book. But,
I had a question about style. One of the things that I remember distinctly about Arcadia is your use of metaphor and simile. And when you read the beginning of this novel, it brought that back to mind. It's almost overwhelming to me at some points. Like, they're beautiful, but you write a lot of them to my memory of it.
It's a taste.
Not a bad thing.
See, you fail too.
they are beautiful. I was just wondering if you could comment on your use of imagery and
Yeah.
metaphor and simile?
I mean, I don't really have a theory or philosophy of it. I do it for pacing in a certain way. And so, I mean, I think probably when I want to slow the pacing down, I probably put more in. But it's also a way of setting the scene, right? And taking your time within a scene and being able to fully imagine things that matter. And I try really hard to not have anything superfluous in my books, right? I go through many times with a red pen, and in fact, this book was 1,000 pages at a certain point. I just like cut a whole bunch of shit away. So you know what is left is, I guess, the things that matter to me somehow on an emotional level, and I probably could not articulate why they mattered, but it hit something. It hit some bell in me that I felt needed to be hit at that point, and that's what style is, right? It's like a reaching toward certain tones and certain bells at a certain point in order to give a certain effect. So, yeah.
Intrigued by Lotto's relationship with Leo and what that might mean for his relationship with Mathilde or his creative process. And more particularly, I really wanted to hear what Leo's aria sounded like.
I know. So should we? Yeah. What do we do? What do we do?
You know what? Well, I don't know. But you know what? We can make that a broader question, because I think one of the things we didn't talk about, but you're talking about the aria, is that similar to our, I'm trying to remember, Monsters at Templeton. We're going way back to your first novel. You used artifacts within it. You had photographs, you had documents, you had all these wonderful things so that we could be detective almost along with the Upton character. But in this book, you used text within text, and it was really kind of interesting. So like the aria was mentioned, his plays, you had little excerpts, you had things about opening night rehearsal. It's an interesting way to add into the story, and as you said, it really sparks your curiosity to want to know more.
Right.
But what was your intention by putting these in? What do you feel it added to the text itself?
I mean, you always try to figure out which form is going to tell the story the best, right? And because he's a playwright, you know, I thought that the putting some of the time passing in scenes made a lot of sense. It was also super fun, and it was a way to talk about how certain elements in life come back through the writing of things, right? I mean, certain images repeat in the things that Lotto makes. Certain people come back through and out again. But I also would love to hear that opera or to see it. And it's like my dream to see the opera that I wrote in this book on this stage. It would be so fabulous. And I've been trying to talk to composers to do it. So if you know any composers, I really want to do it. But it's too crazy. I mean, like, there's it's a story of Antigone if she hadn't actually hanged herself, if she had actually like been preserved underground in this little cave that sort of goes through time and space. and it's funny, right? Like, I think it's funny. At least I laughed. But she also, like, she has this language that is just, she hears some language filtering down through, and it affects the Greek that she knows, and so she loses a lot of her syntax, so there are no tenses. So I would have to create this whole new lexicon of pseudo-Greek, which would be so fun. I mean, like, I actually have probably 8 pages of words that I've turned into, you know, Antigone's language. So in my head, I had the Jonsi from Sigur Rós as the contralto. So it's more like a Sigur Rossi kind of opera. That'd be great, right? I totally want that to happen. Does anybody know Jonsi? Yeah. So what else? And so about the other thing, which I don't necessarily want to say too much about it, but I think when you're in a creative partnership, you can just fall in love with that brain. And in fact, you know, I read so much, and you read so much, and in a way, you can think of a book as someone else's brain in your hands that slowly, through the process of reading, infects your own brain, right? And if it's a book that you deeply, deeply love, you're kind of falling in love with someone else's brain at that moment. You know, if you see a play and it blows you away, you fall in love with someone else in a certain way, right? The product of that person, and that's an essential element of who that person is. I think it's really beautiful, right? It's a way of falling in love all the time without necessarily being unfaithful to your partner.
And I think that's one of the things that, you know, without ruining the end of the book, that you really are left with, this feeling that somehow through his work, through his plays, that other people will find little pieces of who he is in that work and be able to see him by piecing it together. My experience with reading, if you want to laugh, that thinking, is that every book I read, my poor husband has to sit there and listen to me, and I'm usually laying in bed, and I'm like, oh my God, this is me. I think this is everything that's happening here is me. And he's like, every book is not you. I think you're reading a little too deeply into it. But it is me.
It is you.
And I think that's the reflective nature of good literature, is that you can see yourself in it at some point.
Yeah.
I see it a lot more because I have a big fat ego and head, but whatever.
Thank you.
I was curious about Mathilde because we haven't really talked about her too much, and she's, I just think, unbelievably fascinating. And I was interested in terms of her early trauma and the impact of that on her life. And being a child psychologist, I just got really stuck there, and I just thought it was brilliant. And I just wondered, did you kind of go back to kind of think when you saw her and you created her as this adult, did you think how did she get to be like that? Or did you kind of start with her childhood and then build her up? And what did you think about that early trauma? And it's obviously trauma is, I think, is the right word in this incredible loneliness and despair that came out of that. And I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
Without giving away too
much. I think Mathilde is tremendously tough. And I find her clear-sighted, and I find her resistant. So I actually think that the trauma somehow made her able to focus and to be the person who's able to see really, really far into the distance, right? And it made her able to make these choices which, if you didn't know who she is, would seem insane. But they're right for her because she's tough and she's a survivor, right? And she will not succumb. So I agree with you. There is a trauma there, but somehow it made her, it warped her a little bit, right? But it also made her who she is, and I love who she is. And I not everybody does, but there's part of me that wants to be her a little bit more.
Well, there's so much strength in the fact that she took that situation and she learned how to survive it, and those skills really kind of served her throughout her life. That was her way of making it through the world.
Yeah.
And I found it kind of refreshing.
Okay.
Yeah, she had a tough life, but she made something of it, and she was able to manipulate her world to be what she needed it to be.
There's nothing more amazing than seeing someone who is just incandescent with anger, able to control that anger, right? That is one of the most charismatic things you've ever seen, because most people can't control it. It just goes blah, right? And it explodes into the world. But to see someone able to keep the pitch and intensity going for a long time, it's almost beautiful, and it's the light that it gives off.
Well, I can't tell you how thrilled I am always to talk to you, and I really want to thank you more for your honesty about your work. I love that you just really put it all out there. I can't wish you anything more than continued success with this book and anything else that you write in the future. And for all of you, I want to thank you for being here. And if I could just leave you with one thing. If you leave here tonight, which is one thing besides Lauren's book, which you have to leave with, I really want you to have the feeling that Lauren Groff, which is how I feel, is probably one of the most unique and talented writers writing today. And I'm really thrilled.
Thank you. Thank you.